You just... I think we'll keep doing that, yeah. That's a different story. Am I live? Well, good. We'll see. I didn't really make it real clear that we'll be live streaming, but maybe some people are home watching. But I kind of made sure that you knew what was coming up. But if there is somebody live stream watching us there, good to have you with us. This will be it. So won't be tuning in next week. But it is going to be a little bit more of a lecture tonight as we introduce it. Then I'm going to hand you a message from Jesus, Revelation Now, lesson number 1. As you go home, you can take it with you and look over it. Whether you want to go ahead and fill in the blanks, you're more than welcome to, but we'll then go over it next week and more of a discussion type approach rather than me just standing here lecturing, which, good night, we do that on Sabbath, so we don't need to do it at prayer meeting too. But I know that's the kind that it's hard to have a discussion in a live stream it. It just makes it real difficult. And so for that reason, all right, we lecture instead of doing too much with an audience participation. But that stops tonight. We won't do that anymore. But tonight we are going to lay the groundwork for how in the world the disciple John got in the middle of the Aegean Sea on the island of Patmos. And so that's our goal tonight as we talk about that. And so let's begin with a word of prayer. Loving Father in heaven, we thank you for our study tonight. We are so pleased that we can meet during the middle of the week here at our church. We pray that you be with us tonight. Give us wonderful understanding, wisdom, as we look at how your disciple John was forced really to be on Patmos, but there you came in vision, and John was shared so much, and because of that we have the book of Revelation. So be with us tonight as we start our new subject, and that is the book of Revelation going forward. So be with us. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. All right. How in the world did John get on Patmos? Of course, we are well acquainted with the disciple John. At a very early age, as a teenager, he began to follow John the Baptist. In fact, if historians are correct, we don't have this information in the Bible, but if historians are correct, John was born in AD 6 or AD 7. We have historians that tell both. Some historians say AD 6, some historians say AD 7. Close enough. And so when in AD 27 Jesus began his ministry, well, John was 21 years old when he started following Jesus. We believe he was the youngest of all the 12 disciples. Of course, he had an older brother, James, and along with his older brother and Peter, James, and John, you see that trio again and again and again in the Gospels as what we often call the inner circle of the disciples of Christ. And of course, John was certainly the most present at the crucifixion of Jesus. He, of course, was in the garden. It all ran away at first, but he quickly, evidently, decided to be involved, and so he would catch up with Jesus at Caiaphas' house and follow him to Caiaphas' home there, where he was first brought, and then, of course, to when he was brought before Pilate. But John followed. John was at the cross. We believe the only disciple at the cross. And at the foot of the cross, it was Jesus as he spoke to John and to his mother, Mary, that John would take on the responsibility of watching over Mary the rest of her life. And so we have John the disciple. After Christ's crucifixion and ascension, he, along with most of the disciples, stayed in Jerusalem, which is what Jesus counseled them to do. They stayed in town until persecution was ramped up. Once James, John's older brother, was executed, and then once Peter had been thrown in prison, yes, let go, but that was about the time the disciples said, this now needs to, we need to get out of town. And they would. Peter and John would both go to Samaria and be there with Philip. But as time passed, and as the young church grew, John, like Peter, Paul, of course, now is involved. They're on a vast traveling. They're traveling preachers, traveling evangelists. But John, along with the mother of Mary, would settle in Ephesus. That's where they would have their home. Ephesus, large city. We believe it's the third or fourth largest city in the entire empire of Rome at the time. Rome is the largest city. Alexandria, Egypt is the second largest city. Athens is the third largest city. Maybe Corinth is in there. But then for sure, Ephesus. Ephesus had 200,000 people living in it when the disciple John and Mary would have moved there. And quite a Christian establishment was there, hotbed of Christianity, really. And John basically took over the reins of the Christian church there in Ephesus. Paul would come by, of course, and spend time in, which is one of the 7 churches. And of course, we'll look at Ephesus here in a couple of weeks as we begin our study in the book of Revelation. But so here, John and Mary, they make their way to Ephesus, a hotbed of Christianity, and there they live. John travels probably on speaking appointments, but his headquarters is in Ephesus. And we'll talk a little bit as I get to the screen, a little bit more about Ephesus, because remarkably, this is where Emperor Domitian and John come in contact with one another. Quite the story. But that's how John gets to Ephesus, he and Mary. Now, Mary will pass away there at Ephesus, and of course, John would continue to live on. Now, Emperor Domitian, the second youngest son of Vespasian. Domitian was 12 years old when his dad Vespasian became emperor of Rome, just a 12-year-old. And after his father Vespasian would die, Domitian's older brother, Titus was 11 years older than Domitian. Titus, who is the one who came to Jerusalem in 70 AD and leveled it, he's the one who now becomes emperor of Rome. Vespasian ruled for about a decade, but Titus only was emperor for a couple of years. He died suddenly at a young age. We don't know, I say young, he in his 40s, but that sounds young to me. But so a relatively young man. It's wondered whether there was some underhandedness in his death, but we're not told. We do not know. Nothing is reported. So Titus, he's emperor for only 2 years, and after Titus dies, Domitian, his younger brother, would now be emperor of Rome. He came to the throne at the age of 30. So a relatively young man. He would rule from 81 AD to 96 AD, about 15 years. He would be assassinated. He would be murdered by his own palace court. fed up with him. He was a rather demigod. He basically put the Senate out to pasture and said, I'm divine, I am God. In fact, he demanded that he be called. When you address me, you call me the Lord God. They did not care for that. But he was the very first Caesar, very first emperor of the Rome who deified himself before he died. Now, all Caesars were deified, made gods after they died, and you worshiped. No. He wanted to be worshiped while he was alive. The phrase, I think I've said this before, the phrase, worship the ground he walked on, came from Domitian, as people were required to worship the very dirt that he passed by on. He was a prolific builder. He wasn't that much into military, although he was the emperor when Rome conquered what we call Britain. He conquered that territory under his rule, although, he was not a military genius, but he had good generals. He tried to go into Scotland, where Scotland is now, and that didn't work, so they gave up on Scotland. But they did conquer Britain. But like I said, he came to the throne at age 30. At the age of 45, he is assassinated and killed because they just couldn't stand him any longer. We believe the Senate had a lot to do with it. But and then his councilman, Nerva, who does enter into our story a little bit, Nerva becomes emperor of Rome. He's only emperor for a year and a half. He's old. He had been consul way back in Vespasian's day. Vespasian, Nerva was he really steadied the thing. Nero, he was a disaster, of course. Nero was persecuting the Christians. He burned down half of Rome. He would end up basically committing suicide with the help of a slave. But after Nero died, 3 emperors came to the throne in about a 16-month period. It was just civil war after the death of Nero, and it was really Nerva who came in and calmed the waters, but it would be years before he would actually be the emperor. But he came to the throne of Rome at a very important time when John is on the island of Patmos, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit, because Nerva was 67 when he came to the throne of Rome and died just a year and a half later. But he did a very important thing during that year and a half, and so we'll look at that. The city of Ephesus, in spite of it being a Christian hotbed, it was also a pagan hotbed, because one of the 7 wonders of the world was in the city of Ephesus. Anybody know which one? Temple of Diana or Artemis. The Greek name was Artemis. This is in, of course, Ephesus today. The ruins are in the country of Turkey, but at that time had a very Hellenistic background, Greece. And so the Greek goddess Artemis was what the temple of Artemis was built. Largest temple the world has ever known. We've never known a larger one. And so it's just a grand, and we'll take a look at some pictures. What you're seeing on the screen is what is called the Temple of Domitian. What did the Ephesians do for Domitian, their emperor? Well, they decided that they would honor him with his own temple. By the way, other cities were doing this because, remember, he deified himself while he was still alive. You worship me now. Don't wait till I die. You worship me now. And so this was Emperor Domitian, why he was not really liked by the aristocracy of Rome. The common people really had no problem with him. He raised the minimum wage, which was a smart thing to do to get the people on your side. And so everybody got a pay raise across Rome. But what you're looking at is the ruins of the Temple of Domitian. Now you'll see it's nowhere in comparison to the temple of Artemis or the temple of Diana, but still they wanted to honor Domitian with a temple. And inside the temple was a statue that they made of Domitian. The statue no longer is all in one piece, but it was a big statue. The temple of Domitian, Emperor Domitian, was about as tall as it was wide. It wasn't all that long, just about like a house, 40 feet wide, approximately 80 feet long. But it was awfully high, because you can see this statue stood inside of the temple of Domitian, and so we do have this likeness of Domitian. When Domitian would be assassinated by his own palace guards and court, 5 people were really involved in the actual murder while he sat right at his desk signing some paperwork. But of course, it seemed like most of the Roman aristocracy was in on it and wanted it to happen, wanted to be rid of Domitian. But this temple was built for him, and he came to the city of Ephesus for its grand opening. To how we honor new places of and we cut the ribbon. Who knows what all they did? But this statue stood in the temple of Domitian, and Domitian himself comes for the grand opening. And what they do on this occasion is that we're going to require all the religious leaders to come and worship Emperor Domitian. Now, guess who was in charge of the Christian church in Ephesus? John. The disciple John is the head of the church at Ephesus. So John is required by the city officials to come to the temple of Domitian and bow down before this statue. Let me just go ahead and show you the other pictures, and so we have the full flavor. This, by the way, is a rebuilt temple of Artemis or temple of Diana. It's hard to tell just the size of it, but it was mammoth. The temple of Artemis, the temple of Diana, Ephesus itself. Ephesus itself stood for several hundred years as a major metropolitan, big right there on the crossroads. It would be destroyed in a pretty significant way by the Goths in 265. Remember, Rome is invaded from all angles, and the Goths are the one that come to Ephesus and take it over, capture it. They do leave, but they strip it of everything. They do a lot of damage to the temple of Diana, temple of Artemis. They would rebuild Ephesus, but then the city of Ephesus in the 4th century, there was a massive earthquake. And the earthquake was so huge that it even changed the harbor. You see, Ephesus sat right on the water, right on the coast there of the ocean there at Turkey, and what we call the Aegean Sea. But it so disrupted the harbor. The earth actually exploded in the harbor, and the city of Ephesus, after that earthquake was done, is now 1.5 miles from the water. They were right on it. One of the greatest harbors, natural harbors in the world was there. But now the city is 1.5 miles from the port, and it loses. They looked at, is it possible to... Ephesus was abandoned. And it stayed in ruins, and that's what we will see here today. But so Ephesus, there's a city, Selkirk, just about 0.5 mile from it. That's a modern city there in Turkey. But Ephesus, by the way, this is the temple of Artemis, temple of Diana. This is what's left of what I did. Here's what it looked like And Paul would have seen it. John would have seen it. Mary would have seen it. Any other disciples that went to Ephesus, they would have seen this. And you remember, Paul had a problem, didn't he? With the people who made little statues of the Princess Artemis. Quite a exotic little statue, but Paul was messing everything up. People were converting to Christianity, and they were losing money. Couldn't sell their little statues, and so there was an uproar when Paul was in Ephesus. That would have been earlier than the events. Obviously, Paul died before the destruction of Jerusalem. In fact, all the disciples died before the fall of Jerusalem except John and Paul. But John was really the last man standing. John, if he was born, I said, in 6 or 7 AD is the best information we have. The best information we have on his death was somewhere between 100 and 104 AD. So John would die in his late 90s, of old age in his bed. John, he's got this, who would we compare him to? Like Wyatt Earp. Wyatt Earp, nobody was in harm's way more here in America than Wyatt Earp. Bullets were flying all over the place. He was in more gunfights and never got a scratch. Died in his bed at the age of 81 in Los Angeles, California, where he was helping on movies, westerns. When he died, his wife Josephine lived another 15 years, but they're both buried there in California. But John was like Wyatt Earp. Scrape after scrape, and one major scrape here by Domitian, of course, that we're going to mention. But he was thrown in jail, this and that. Disciples were falling all around him. He lives till he's almost 100 years old without a scratch. Miraculous, really. Don't know about Wyatt Earp being miraculous. I suppose so. But John, miracle. Because Jesus had something in store for John. And that was after he gets off Patmos. Do you know that's when he does all of his writing? Now, we believe he certainly wrote things down on the island of Patmos because that's when he was having the visions about Revelation. More than likely, he wrote much of Revelation while on Patmos. But the 3 epistles that bear his name and the gospel that bears his name, that was not written until after he got off Patmos. Here he is in his late 90s. So the last half dozen years of his life after he gets off Patmos, he writes it all. And so that's when we're not sure. It's either John or the 3 epistles of John are his last things that he wrote. Almost seems like the Gospel of John was the last thing that he wrote. But this is the Temple of Artemis when you saw it before it was destroyed, and this is the ruins today. This is all that's left standing of that Temple of Diana. This is Caretas Street there in Ephesus. Caretuses were the priests of the Temple of Artemis, and they named the street after the priests who would have procession down this street from the Gate of Hercules at the harbor up to the Temple of Artemis. This street was almost 2.5 football fields long. So it's rather lengthy, not as wide as a football field. It was columned. We're told by the historian Claudius that it was in his day one of the 3 lighted streets in the world. Rome had a lighted street, Athens had a lighted street, and Ephesus had a lighted street where it was lit up at night. And markets were open at night. Here they had activity at night, where other cities, of course, closed after dark. But this street, all kinds of, it had 2-story buildings and lined with shops and places to eat. How about that? Sound familiar? And so that was this street. But this is what it looks like today. It's in ruins. Again, the earthquake basically destroyed much of the city. By the way, John is buried at Ephesus. This is where they claim his tomb is at. They built this little special thing for Pope Paul. Pope Paul came to visit Ephesus to pray over. By the way, it was Pope John Paul. And so he came to pray over. And there's pictures. They had some snapshots of him praying here. But this was built at that time. Before, it was a little bit different. But this was built especially for Pope John Paul's visit. But this is where supposedly the disciple John is buried. And we do know. We do believe that John and the mother of Jesus, Mary, were both buried in Ephesus. They will take you to a little building that supposedly was Mary's house. I don't know how they know that. But anyway, that's what they claim. This is the island of Patmos today. It's a rather tropical place. Typical Greece. It's got that white look. Everything's painted white, you know. Typical Greek island. But this is what Patmos looks like today. You do have a remnant, a monastery. It's been rebuilt and rebuilt and rebuilt over the years. It looks like this. And they have built this over the spot they claim is where John, this little room, this little grotto is inside that monastery. This is where John, they claim, received the visions for the book of Revelation. We know he was on this island. Whether this is the little spot, but this is where they will take you on the tourist trips to see this little room that John received the visions of Revelation. Is that it? That's it. And so, Domitian, he comes to Ephesus in order to be there for the grand opening of a temple that's built in his honor. They've got this tall statue of him. And so they are to bring all the religious leaders, and evidently there's quite a few different religions, but one of them is Christianity. And so John, the disciple John, who's now somewhere toward his late 80s, early 90s, he is brought to this temple. The temple of Domitian. Again, it looks like that now. But he's brought to the doorway, and Domitian himself is there, and these people are supposed, you bow down. I saw that in the flash on the back. You bow down. What do you think John did? John said, no, won't do that. He refused to bow. That did not go over well with Domitian, as you can expect. Were there others? We're not told. Historians tell us John would not bow the knee. He's arrested. We believe, more than likely, as Domitian then returns to Rome, in tow are John and maybe others, we don't know. John is taken back to Rome. And there, of course, Ellen White steps in and tells us that Domitian has John tried and found guilty of treason because he would not bow to Domitian's statue in Ephesus. And he's thrown into a cauldron. And by the way, Ellen White's not the only one. Ellen White gets this from the history books. He was thrown in a cauldron of oil to be burned and alive. What happens? Not a thing. That's what I mean. He had this Wyatt Earp thing about him. One scrape after another, and you can't kill this guy. And so John survives. What do you do with him now? Put him on Patmos. Patmos at that time was a penal colony. And of course, I showed you pictures of it. But John is escorted to the island of Patmos. It's about 30 miles off the coast, right off Ephesus in Turkey. And Patmos, part of the Greek Isles today. And that's where he would spend only about 16 to 18 months. John was there because Domitian will be assassinated. Nerva comes to the throne, and Nerva cleans house. All political and religious prisoners that are locked up, he releases them. Even though Nerva is only on the throne of Rome for a little over a year, he's in the right spot at the right time. And John is removed from Patmos somewhere around a year and a half after he was put on it. And so he is allowed to come back. Where does he go? He comes back to Ephesus. And that's where he will live out the remainder of his life. But it is remarkable to see how God worked, isn't it? Here's John the disciple. He's now in his 90s on the Isle of Patmos, still alive. The average age at that time was about 50 as far as how long you lived. Nowhere near 100. But John stays alive. Whether he gets to the age of 100 depends on whether he died in 100 AD or 104 AD. It just kind of depends there whether he was 95, 98, whatever he might have been when he passed away and died there in the city of Ephesus. But this is the story of how John writes the book of Revelation while there on Patmos, or at least he gets the visions. Does he write some after he gets off Ephesus? Well, possibly. But then he does his great works. The Gospel of John, one of the greatest works you'll ever find is the Gospel of John on the life of Jesus. And of course, Revelation is extremely important. Also, over the next, well, I guess I haven't looked at how many lessons, but I am going to pass this out to you before I forget it. Yeah, Wayne, come on up. David, come on up too if you want. And just pass those out and bring them back next week. Again, you can fill in the blanks if you want to. But starting next week, a much more roundtable discussion. I doubt we'll change our setup, but we will no longer be live streaming because we want discussion. We want to talk. We want to back and forth. I want you to ask questions. We're going to go through the questions of these study guides. Certainly, we're going to go much larger than these study guides as I talk to you about what's going on in Revelation. But just take these home. If you forget them, we'll have copies again next week. But take them, look them over. Great information from a previous pastor of yours, right? Tony was a previous pastor here in Morganton. We use his studies in our prison ministry. I would imagine, Ted, you've used this one at prison ministry, even though it's not the one we were using when they shut us down. But still, it's I could not really find a question discussion type lesson study on Revelation. I see a lot of books on Revelation, but nothing that really had this format, and so Ted suggested we use this, and so that's what we'll try to use. But again, we'll go much larger than the study guide, but it'll be our jumping off, our starting point.
Got a letter from the prisoner today that said he just couldn't wait to get out and come to church.
Well, good. Well, that's fantastic. I am going to meet with the board members just a little bit tonight after our prayer time. And so I had planned here, thought, well, we're going to shut down just a little early because we've got a little issue that I need to talk to board members about. But at this time, and by the way, John, he knew he wasn't going to be here, so he talked to me today, John Steinkraus, and said, please pray for him. He's turning around and coming right back. But he is taking his dad. I saw his dad off yesterday. They were doing some measuring there at the thrift store as we prepare for our work bee this Sunday. By the way, John's dad was a building contractor. That is what John's dad did. And so John Jr. was getting advice from John Sr., I guess. But anyway, John was suggesting how we do some of the sign work. At least that's what they were talking about when Deborah and I left at 5 o'clock. We left them there.